In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers vanished without a trace along a 20-mile stretch of the wilderness road in southeastern Kentucky. Their horses were found wandering aimlessly, their belongings scattered across the rugged landscape. Silent remnants that offered no clues to their fate. What makes these disappearances especially chilling is not just their number, but the fact that local authorities deliberately suppressed every record of the investigation that followed. For over 2 centuries, the truth about the Harden family farm remained buried within sealed court archives, until a county clerk's discovery in Mamre, 1987 uncovered what would become known as one of the most disturbing cases of organized murder in early American frontier history. The unearthed documents described a killing operation so precise, so perfectly disguised as Christian charity, that it operated undetected for 8 years. Before we explore the horrifying story of the farm that became Kentucky's first true house of horrors, remember to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We're about to reveal secrets powerful families tried to keep hidden forever. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. The discovery that would expose the Harden family's crimes began not with screams in the night, but with a simple act of bureaucratic housekeeping in a dusty courthouse basement. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a land balanced precariously between civilization and wilderness, where the promise of prosperity drew thousands westward along perilous mountain trails. The Wilderness Road, carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 2 decades earlier, had become the main artery for settlers pushing west from Virginia and the Carolinas. This narrow, winding route stretched for more than 200 miles through unforgiving terrain, where a single misstep could mean death from exposure, wild animals, or the countless human predators who stalked the frontier. Along this treacherous trail, small settlements sprouted like wildflowers after rain, each one a fragile beacon of hope for families seeking new beginnings. These outposts served as vital way stations where exhausted travelers could rest, resupply, and share warnings about the dangers ahead. The survival of each settlement often depended on its ability to offer safety and trust to the endless stream of migrants who passed through. One such community was Millfield, a modest township perched at a crucial bend in the road where the trail descended from the rocky ridges into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. With barely 300 residents, Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, or thought they did. Founded in 1794 by a group of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, the town reflected its founders' strict moral code in every aspect of daily life. Sunday services were mandatory, and local authorities enforced rigid rules governing everything from drinking to dancing. At the town's center stood Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log structure that served as both trading post and informal courthouse. Jeremiah Hendrick, a gruff former militiaman who had once fought alongside Daniel Boone, ran the establishment with an iron will and a sharp sense for profit. His shelves were stocked with the essentials of frontier life: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the latest scraps of news from the world beyond the mountains. Nearby, the Cumberland Inn stood as a symbol of frontier luxury, a 2-story structure built by Martha Crane, a widowed entrepreneur from Philadelphia. For 2 bits a night, travelers could enjoy a warm meal, a clean bed, and the rare comfort of civilized conversation. The town's spiritual life revolved around the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a modest log chapel that could accommodate Millfield's entire population during Sunday worship. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-educated minister who had left behind a comfortable Boston parish for the hardships of frontier missions, delivered sermons that blended theology with practical wisdom for survival. His presence lent the town an air of legitimacy that drew settlers who might otherwise have continued westward. Among Millfield's most respected families were the Hardens, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy. The family had arrived in 1791, claiming to be refugees from Indian raids that had devastated their Virginia home. Quickly, they established themselves as pillars of the community. Ezekiel assisted Reverend Cole as a lay preacher, while Temperance organized charitable aid for struggling settlers. Ezekiel Harden was a commanding figure, standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and an intense presence that demanded attention. His deep voice could fill the church with ease, his sermons stirring congregants to tears as he spoke of divine love and eternal judgment. Many claimed he preached as though he had glimpsed both heaven and hell firsthand. Temperance, in contrast, was small and delicate, her prematurely gray hair framing a face marked by tireless compassion. Known for her healing skills, she served as the community's unofficial physician, treating everything from broken bones to difficult births with uncanny expertise. Her knowledge of herbal medicine bordered on miraculous, and her reputation spread far beyond Millfield's borders. Their children appeared to embody the virtues of frontier life. Caleb, the eldest at 26, shared his father's strength and his mother's kindness, laboring tirelessly on the family's farm and often assisting neighbors in need. Josiah, at 24, was more reserved and intellectual, serving as the local schoolmaster during the winter months. Mercy, the youngest at 22, was renowned for her beauty and gentle nature, admired by all who knew her. The Harden farm sprawled across 400 acres of fertile bottomland along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of Millfield. Ezekiel had invested nearly every cent he owned in the land, a gamble that paid off handsomely. The farm produced abundant crops of corn and tobacco, while the creek powered a small grist mill. Visitors often remarked on the family's prosperity, noting that their wealth seemed far greater than could be explained by farming alone. Their home reflected both comfort and caution, a 2-story log house with stone chimneys and glass windows, an uncommon luxury on the frontier. Inside, it was furnished with carved chairs, imported china, silver candlesticks, and an impressive collection of books. A massive barn sheltered 50 horses, and the outbuildings included a smokehouse, dairy, blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel proudly called the largest root cellar in the county. What made the Hardens beloved by the community was their extraordinary generosity toward travelers. On the harsh frontier, hospitality could mean the difference between life and death, and the Hardens took this duty to heart. Stranded families often found refuge at their farm, with Ezekiel himself braving storms to rescue broken wagons or injured horses. Temperance's infirmary, stocked with surgical tools and rare medicines, saved countless lives. By 1798, the Harden farm had become a well-known refuge along the Wilderness Road, so well known that guides routinely directed travelers there, assuring them of fair prices and a safe night's rest. Mercy kept a detailed guest book, recording the names and origins of hundreds who had passed through. But on the frontier, where danger lurked in every shadow and trust could be fatal, appearances could deceive. The first hint that something was deeply wrong came on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington as planned. Fletcher was no ordinary traveler. He was a seasoned merchant, known for his reliability and punctuality in a world where timing often meant the difference between fortune and ruin. His disappearance marked the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Kentucky for generations. For 12 years, Samuel Fletcher had braved the perilous journey between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times a year, transporting manufactured goods westward and returning east with raw materials. His business partner, Thomas Greeley, knew him well. Fletcher was punctual, methodical, and cautious to a fault. He never deviated from his route, never took unnecessary risks, and always sent word if his plans changed. So when 5 days passed without any message, 2 beyond his promised arrival, Greeley was certain that something had gone terribly wrong. At dawn on October 18th, Greeley began retracing Fletcher's route from Lexington, questioning innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the way. Everyone confirmed seeing Fletcher, each account placing him firmly on schedule. The trail remained clear until Greeley reached the outskirts of Millfield, where Fletcher seemed to have simply vanished. The first real clue came at noon on the second day of searching. Fletcher's distinctive bay mare was discovered grazing freely near Miller's Creek, her saddle still in place, the animal calm and uninjured. She appeared well-fed and groomed, suggesting deliberate care rather than abandonment. Most curious of all, the bridle had been neatly removed and hung over a low branch as if by human hands. Inside the saddlebags, Greeley found Fletcher's goods untouched, along with a leather pouch containing nearly $50 silver, a considerable sum on the frontier. The money's presence ruled out robbery, the most common fate of the missing along the Wilderness Road. More unsettling still, Fletcher's personal effects were scattered in a straight line, leading away from the trail and into the woods. It looked as though he had been dragged or forced to move, dropping his belongings one by one in a futile attempt to leave a sign. Constable Jacob Winters was called to investigate. A former Continental Army sergeant who had served under General Anthony Wayne, Winters was known for his discipline, courage, and an unflinching familiarity with death. He had seen enough bloodshed to recognize when something defied the ordinary. Fletcher's disappearance, he decided, was anything but routine. Within hours, Winters assembled a search party of 12 men, some of the most capable frontiersmen in Millfield. Among them was Henrik Johansson, a Swedish tracker whose skills were said to rival those of the native Shawnee, and Benjamin Stokes, a hardened ex-bounty hunter who knew every hidden hollow within 50 miles. Together they followed the faint trail of evidence leading toward the Harden property. The path was marked by small, haunting signs, shreds of fabric snagged on thorns, and here and there faint drops of what appeared to be blood. The clues suggested Fletcher had been alive but wounded, possibly struggling against captors. But at the precise edge of the Harden farm, all signs abruptly stopped. The forest floor beyond showed no footprints, no struggle, no disturbed soil, nothing. It was as though Samuel Fletcher had simply ceased to exist. Even Johansson, whose tracking skills were legendary, admitted defeat in the face of such complete disappearance. When Winters questioned Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch's demeanor was calm and cooperative, but there was something almost rehearsed about his account. He admitted that Fletcher had indeed stopped at the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had been seeking directions to a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel claimed he had warned the merchant against straying from the main road, but Fletcher was determined to continue before nightfall. The merchant, Harden said, appeared anxious, frequently checking his saddlebags and glancing behind him as if afraid of being followed. He mentioned in passing that strange men had trailed him since Virginia, but insisted on pressing on alone. Ezekiel's entire family corroborated the story in identical detail. Temperance recalled Fletcher declining a meal, but accepting a small vial of her herbal tonic for a stomach ailment. Caleb remembered offering to guide him partway, but said Fletcher refused, citing urgency. Even Mercy and Josiah provided the same descriptions, down to the merchant's nervous gestures and final words. To Winters, their precision was unnerving. Real witnesses, he knew, rarely told the same story word for word. The Harden's version sounded memorized, too perfect, too clean, too practiced. As Winters toured the property, his unease deepened. Since his last visit months earlier, the layout had changed considerably. A new smokehouse stood near the barn, larger than any family would reasonably need, built of unusually thick stone walls. Freshly turned soil surrounded several outbuildings, hinting at recent, large-scale digging. The once modest root cellar had been expanded dramatically, its reinforced timber entrance now wide enough to fit a wagon. When questioned about the improvements, Ezekiel explained that the farm's recent prosperity had allowed for expansions. The enlarged cellar, he said, was for storing their increased harvest, and the smokehouse was intended to support commercial meat sales in Lexington. His explanations were logical, his tone steady, but Winters sensed careful calculation in every word. Even more troubling was the family's demeanor. Their famed warmth seemed brittle, as though strained under invisible tension. Temperance's hands trembled as she served coffee. Mercy glanced repeatedly toward her father before speaking. Caleb and Josiah, once outgoing and confident, appeared cautious, even fearful. Something was wrong beneath the surface. But without evidence, Winters could do nothing. With no body, no witnesses, and no proof of foul play, Fletcher's disappearance was officially attributed to bandits or Indian attack, just another casualty of the perilous frontier. His horse was sold at auction to settle his debts, and within weeks, his name faded from conversation. But Fletcher's fate was not an isolated tragedy. It was the beginning of something far darker. Over the next 8 months, the Wilderness Road became a corridor of terror. From the winter of 1798 through the spring of 1799, travelers vanished with alarming regularity. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another life swallowed by the wilderness near Millfield. The victims ranged from solitary merchants to entire families, even armed parties traveling together for safety. All disappeared without a trace. One detail connected them all. Each had been seen asking for, or heading toward the Harden farm before vanishing. In November, Dr. Marcus Cromwell, a respected physician traveling from Richmond to establish a practice in Louisville, became the next victim. At 43, he carried his entire livelihood, medical instruments, books, and supplies worth over $300, the savings of a lifetime. His overturned wagon was found near Devil's Fork, a mere 3 miles from the Harden farm. The contents were scattered but untouched, as though whoever had stopped him had no interest in wealth, only in the man himself. Local authorities initially assumed that Dr. Marcus Cromwell had been thrown from his wagon during an accident and had wandered into the wilderness in a confused state, eventually succumbing to exposure. The theory seemed reasonable until searchers realized that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the wreckage. The leather satchel had contained surgical instruments of remarkable quality, among them a bone saw and amputation kit that would be of great value to anyone attempting to practice medicine on the frontier. No wild animal would have taken such items, and ordinary thieves would likely have chosen the scattered coins and trade goods instead. The following month brought the disappearance of the Henley family during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 children had been seeking refuge when their wagon became mired in a snowdrift less than half a mile from the Harden property. According to Ezekiel Harden's later account, the family never arrived at his farm. He presumed they had lost their way in the storm and perished in the cold. Despite extensive searches once the weather cleared, no trace of the Henleys was ever found. The discovery of their wagon a week later only deepened the mystery. It had been pulled from the drift and left beside the road, neatly cleared of snow, and thoroughly searched. The family's clothing and personal effects were gone, yet their provisions and tools were untouched. Tracks in the surrounding snow indicated that several individuals had worked together to free the wagon, a task that would have required time, strength, and determination in such dangerous weather. In January, another respected traveler vanished. Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher known across the frontier for his fearless ministry, disappeared while carrying church donations for a new congregation in Frankfort. For 15 years, Cross had journeyed through the wilderness, surviving attacks, bandits, and every manner of peril. His horse was discovered 3 days later, still saddled and carrying nearly $200 in donations. The money's presence dismissed robbery as a motive but raised troubling questions. What could have overcome such a seasoned man? Officials eventually concluded that Cross had likely suffered a heart attack or stroke and perished somewhere in the surrounding wilderness. Each disappearance followed the same baffling pattern: abandoned horses, scattered belongings that suggested sudden violence, and trails that led toward the Harden property before vanishing without trace. Whenever questioned, the Hardens offered explanations that were perfectly plausible, yet conveniently unprovable. They admitted to having seen some of the missing travelers, but only briefly. They described warning each about storms, outlaws, and treacherous trails, only to have their cautions ignored by travelers intent on keeping their schedules. Constable Winters found himself caught in an impossible bind. The Hardens were among the county's most admired families, their reputation for piety and charity beyond reproach. Ezekiel's sermons drew crowds from miles around, while Temperance's healing skills had saved lives during the fever outbreak the previous summer. To accuse such people without undeniable evidence would ruin him professionally and socially. He knew the fate of lawmen who made reckless charges. They ended up disgraced, unemployed, or worse. And yet, the disappearances clustered too closely, too frequently, all centering near the same farm. Statistically, it defied coincidence. But in the frontier world, statistics meant little without physical proof, and proof seemed to dissolve whenever anyone approached the Harden land. The family opened their doors willingly, invited searches of every building, even joined search parties themselves. Their cooperation was so thorough it began to feel like mockery to the increasingly frustrated constable. The first real break came from an unlikely witness, 9-year-old Timothy Varan, a curious child from a nearby homestead 2 miles east of the Harden place. Timothy often roamed the woods, returning home with stories of his discoveries. But in March 1799, he approached Constable Winters with something different. He claimed to have heard screaming coming from the direction of the Harden farm, terrifying, prolonged cries that sounded unmistakably human. These were not the shouts of argument or pain from an accident, but the anguished screams of someone enduring unimaginable suffering. The boy said he had heard such sounds at least 5 times over the winter, always in the deepest hours of the night. Sometimes, he added, there were other noises, hammering, creaking ropes, even voices chanting in unison. Each episode ended abruptly, followed by an eerie, unnatural silence. When Winters spoke to Timothy's parents, they admitted hearing odd sounds too, but had dismissed them as wind, animals, or tricks of the night. After all, the Hardens were good Christians. What possible explanation could justify screams coming from their farm? Timothy's testimony might have been dismissed as childish fantasy, if not for one chilling detail. He could recall the exact nights when he had heard the screams, and each coincided perfectly with the estimated date of a disappearance. The consistency was too precise to ignore. With the boy's account in hand, Winters began to investigate quietly, questioning neighbors and recording every oddity that had been overlooked or dismissed. Slowly, a troubling pattern began to emerge, a web of small inconsistencies, strange noises and uneasy glances, all circling back to the same respected family whose virtue might have been nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. Each piece of evidence by itself seemed trivial, but together they formed a chilling pattern that made Constable Winters' blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm lay nearest to the Harden property, recalled several nights when she had witnessed unusual activity there. Lanterns flickering between buildings at hours when honest families slept, accompanied by the sounds of digging and heavy work that lasted until dawn. When she had mentioned this to Temperance Harden after church, the woman had smiled and explained that the family preferred to labor during the cooler night hours, while improving their root cellar and storage areas. The excuse had seemed reasonable at the time, but in hindsight, Sarah realized that the nocturnal construction had gone on for far too long to match such modest projects. Stranger still, she had never seen any sign of the massive piles of earth that such digging should have produced. When pressed by Winters, she reluctantly admitted that the noises were sometimes accompanied by muffled voices and, on occasion, what sounded disturbingly like cries of pain. Even more unsettling was the testimony of Henrik Johansson, the seasoned Swedish tracker whose farm bordered the Hardens' land to the north. Johansson had found scattered bones along the shared fence line, bones that didn't resemble ordinary livestock remains. Some were cracked and gnawed, others showed deliberate breakage and saw marks suggesting they had been cut apart by tools. The fragments included those of horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller, unidentifiable pieces that didn't match any known animal. When Johansson questioned Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch explained that wild animals had been unusually troublesome that winter, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased carcasses by scattering them in the woods. But Johansson knew better. The bones were too clean, too uniformly processed, some even showing signs of being boiled. Nothing about them suggested natural decomposition. Reports from other neighbors painted a similar picture of growing unease. The Harden children, once lively and sociable, had become withdrawn and strangely secretive, rarely speaking at church or community gatherings. Caleb and Josiah, formerly confident young men, now appeared nervous and distracted, avoiding eye contact as though burdened by dark thoughts. Mercy Harden's transformation was the most alarming of all. Once the pride of Millfield for her beauty and bright spirit, she now looked frail and haunted, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. She no longer attended social events and, when seen in public, seemed to flinch from human touch as though terrified of revealing something she could not speak aloud. Even Ezekiel's sermons had changed. Once full of hope and compassion, they had grown grim and feverish, filled with visions of divine punishment, purification through suffering, and the cleansing of evil from the world. Parishioners whispered among themselves about his violent tone, but none dared confront him directly. As Winters dug deeper, he found disquieting holes in the family's history. The Hardens claimed to be refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia, but no records supported their story. No one in Virginia recalled such a family or any attack matching their account. Inquiries sent eastward turned up nothing. No birth records, no property deeds, no trace of their existence before their arrival in Kentucky. It was as if they had simply appeared one spring morning in 1791, bringing with them wealth and possessions far too fine for people who claimed to have lost everything. Then, in April 1799 came the breakthrough. A traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster arrived in Millfield, carrying with him stories from Tennessee that shattered any remaining doubt. Brewster, well known across the frontier for his endless travels and sharp memory, told Winters of a series of disappearances that had haunted the Holston River Valley a decade earlier, between 1789 and 1791. 15 travelers had vanished along a lonely road near a prosperous farm owned by a family called Harper, Zachariah and Prudence Harper, and their 3 grown children. The parallels to the Harden case were unmistakable. Each disappearance had followed the same pattern. Travelers last seen heading toward the Harper property, their horses and belongings later found abandoned, and no physical evidence ever recovered. Even more disturbing was the Harper's profile. Zachariah Harper had been a preacher of remarkable charisma, known for his fiery sermons and charitable works. His wife Prudence had been a skilled healer, respected for her knowledge of herbal remedies. The family claimed, too, to be refugees from Indian attacks with no verifiable past. Their reputation for hospitality had made them beloved by the community, until suspicion began to grow. Then one spring night in 1791, they vanished without warning. Their farm was found deserted, the buildings partially burned, the wells filled with rubble, as though someone had tried to erase all trace of what had happened there. When authorities finally searched the Harper property, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination. Shallow graves were scattered throughout the woods, filled with the remains of animals and humans alike. Among the human bones were personal effects belonging to several of the missing travelers, proof that the Harpers had been responsible for their deaths. But the killers were long gone, and despite a 6-month manhunt, they were never found. The case was eventually closed, the family presumed dead or fled beyond the reach of justice. As Brewster recounted these events, Winters felt a chill settle over him. The descriptions of the Harper family matched the Hardens exactly. Zachariah and Prudence could have been Ezekiel and Temperance. Their children's ages and appearances aligned perfectly with Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy. The horrifying implication became undeniable. The Hardens were not simply local killers. They were practiced predators, a family of murderers who had refined their methods across years and miles, shedding one name for another whenever suspicion drew too close. They had not merely moved west seeking opportunity. They had brought their darkness with them, leaving behind a trail of graves that stretched across the wilderness. Even worse, the family's current operation in Kentucky appeared far more advanced and methodical than their earlier crimes in Tennessee. They had learned from their past mistakes, refined their methods of disposing of evidence, and built a convincing new identity that allowed them to continue their killings undetected for nearly 8 years. The scale of their atrocities in Kentucky likely dwarfed their earlier deeds, representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in early American history. The weight of Isaac Brewster's revelations pressed down on Constable Winters like a tangible burden. Yet, despite the strength of the circumstantial evidence, he knew it would not be enough to secure convictions against the Harden family in a court of law. Frontier justice demanded undeniable proof, evidence so solid that no defense or coincidence could explain it away. Winters needed something irrefutable, something that would withstand the scrutiny of judges, attorneys, and skeptical juries alike. That crucial breakthrough came from the last person he would have expected, Mercy Harden herself. On the night of May 22, 1799, the 22-year-old woman appeared at Winters' cabin like an apparition emerging from the night. Her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling from sheer terror. What she confessed over the next 3 hours would unravel the full extent of the horrors hidden at the Harden farm and provide the evidence necessary to expose Kentucky's most infamous family of murderers. According to Mercy's harrowing confession, the Hardens had been systematically murdering travelers for over 8 years, beginning only months after their arrival in Kentucky. But what made her account truly horrifying was not merely the number of victims. It was the cold, ritualistic precision with which the killings were planned and carried out. Under the direction of her father, Ezekiel, the family operated like a religious cult masquerading as frontier Christians. Ezekiel had convinced them that they were agents of divine justice, purging the land of unworthy souls who traveled the frontier roads. Each murder, he claimed, was an act of righteousness, a fulfillment of God's will. The process began with what the family called evaluation. When travelers approached their property, especially those with visible wealth, valuable possessions, or useful skills. Ezekiel would engage them in conversation under the guise of neighborly concern. He asked about their families, their reasons for traveling, their work, and their beliefs. From these discussions, he passed moral judgment, branding the wealthy as greedy, the educated as prideful, and the pious as false believers. Even missionaries and preachers were not exempt, often condemned for supposed heresy or arrogance. Once Ezekiel pronounced his verdict, the family's deadly operation commenced. The chosen victims were invited to stay overnight, often persuaded by Ezekiel's warnings about unsafe roads or by offers of hospitality. The Harden homestead had a reputation for generosity, and few travelers ever declined their invitation. Inside, the doomed guests were treated to lavish meals and warm conversation. Temperance Harden, the matriarch, would prepare hearty dishes, while the children entertained with music and stories. The evening would end with Ezekiel leading prayers, his sermons filled with conviction and biblical eloquence. Yet the final drink or dessert always contained Temperance's secret ingredient, a blend of herbs and toxins perfected through years of experimentation. The mixture induced drowsiness and confusion, mimicking the fatigue of a long day's travel. By morning, the guests would awaken not in their beds, but bound and helpless in the farm's underground chambers, a vast network of tunnels and rooms dug deep beneath the property. Mercy described the labyrinth as stretching hundreds of yards, with multiple levels connected by crude stone steps. At its center stood what Ezekiel called the courtroom, a grotesque parody of divine justice. There he would stage mock trials, accusing victims of sins he claimed justified their deaths. Iron shackles lined the walls, and crude religious symbols hung like twisted relics of salvation. These trials were more than mere cruelty. They were central to Ezekiel's delusion. He had created a perverse theology that allowed his family to view murder as sacred duty rather than crime. Every execution became a purification, every corpse a sacrifice to cleanse the frontier of sin. Punishments varied depending on Ezekiel's whims. Some captives were kept alive for weeks to serve the family's needs, forced to work, teach or share their knowledge before being executed. Dr. Cromwell, a missing physician, had been compelled to teach Temperance advanced surgical methods before his death. Reverend Cross was forced to write sermons that Ezekiel later preached as his own, earning admiration from his congregation. Executions were carried out with grim ceremony. Hanging was reserved for thieves and bandits. Drowning was used for those deemed prideful or blasphemous. The most elaborate deaths were saved for the wealthy and powerful, those Ezekiel judged as the most corrupt. Mercy's testimony revealed the horrifying organization behind the murders. Each family member had a specific role. Caleb and Josiah handled the physical labor, capturing victims, maintaining the tunnels, and disposing of remains through a nearby limestone cave system. Mercy, trapped by fear and obedience, was forced to act as record keeper. Her meticulous ledgers chronicled every victim's name, appearance, possessions, and even their final words, an accounting of death written in a daughter's trembling hand. Temperance's role was the most sinister of all. She prepared the poisons, tended to captives who were kept alive, and ensured that executions left no trace. Her medical expertise, once a gift of healing, had become a science of controlled suffering. She even devised treatments for those who resisted, a series of tortures designed not to kill but to break the human spirit through pain and fear. Under her care, defiance turned to submission, and the victim's will to live was slowly extinguished long before their lives were taken. The Harden's ability to evade detection depended on far more than careful planning. It required an elaborate system of disposal and deception that effectively erased all traces of their crimes. Bodies were never buried on the farm itself. Instead, they were transported through a network of subterranean passages to remote limestone caverns several miles away. These natural chambers provided ideal conditions for decomposition, and their distance from the homestead ensured that no discovery could be linked back to the family. Personal effects were handled with the precision of seasoned traders. Valuables such as money, jewelry, weapons, and tools were either kept for personal use or discreetly sold in distant markets, where no one would question their origins. Less valuable items were scattered strategically along roads and forest trails to create false evidence, suggesting robberies or attacks by native raiders. Even the victim's clothing was sorted methodically, Useful garments were retained by the family, while distinctive pieces were destroyed to prevent identification. The disposal of horses presented a unique challenge, given their high value and the ease with which they could be recognized. To solve this problem, the Hardens developed relationships with dishonest traders in distant counties who asked no questions about the animals' origins. By selling the horses far from where their owners had vanished, the family added another layer of confusion to any investigation that followed. Yet their most ingenious deception lay not in concealment but in reputation. Every charitable act, every sermon delivered by Ezekiel, and every healing performed by Temperance served a dual purpose, building an image of godly virtue while deflecting suspicion. The Hardens had become community pillars, the kind of family people turned to in times of sickness and crisis. Who could possibly suspect that such benevolent figures were behind a string of disappearances? Their strategy even extended to contingency plans for possible investigations. Whenever they sensed growing scrutiny, they would temporarily suspend their killings and increase their acts of public service, reinforcing their saintly image. They had multiple escape routes prepared and supplies cached for a rapid flight, just as they had done years earlier when fleeing Tennessee. According to Mercy, Ezekiel had grown increasingly ambitious. He planned to expand their operations by establishing similar courts of divine justice along the Wilderness Road, remote farms that would serve as new killing sites. His ultimate goal was to create a network of execution chambers across the frontier, purging unworthy souls and reshaping what he saw as the moral fabric of America. What finally drove Mercy to confess was not guilt or moral awakening, it was fear. Ezekiel's paranoia had intensified to the point where anyone who questioned the family's behavior became a target of judgment. Among those now marked for death were several curious neighbors: Isaac Brewster, the traveling peddler whose inquiries had uncovered too much, and even Constable Winters himself. But Mercy's most chilling revelation was that 3 captives were still alive beneath the farm. The first was William Patterson, a traveling surveyor captured 3 days earlier and scheduled for trial the following night. With him were 2 others: Rebecca Foster, a young woman missing for over a week, and Luther Grimby, an elderly preacher who had disappeared the previous month. The presence of multiple prisoners at once proved that the Hardens had grown overconfident and escalated their crimes to an industrial scale, capturing, sorting, and executing victims according to an organized system that treated human beings as expendable resources. Realizing the urgency of the situation, Constable Winters knew there was no time for formal warrants or reinforcements. If Mercy's information was true, innocent lives would be lost within hours. Yet a direct assault on the Harden property was fraught with danger. The family was armed, entrenched, and operating from a fortified position designed precisely for defense. Winters faced an agonizing choice: attempt an immediate rescue and risk his own death, or ride to Lexington for reinforcements, condemning the captives and giving the Hardens time to escape. The decision was made easier when help arrived. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer whose suspicions had long been growing, volunteered without hesitation. His military experience and deep knowledge of the terrain made him invaluable. Isaac Brewster also joined, driven by guilt for failing to expose the Harpers years earlier. 2 more townsmen, Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran of frontier warfare, completed the small rescue party. Their plan was simple but perilous. They would approach the Harden farm after midnight on May 23rd, using the darkness to gain the element of surprise. Their priority was rescuing the prisoners. Capturing the killers alive was secondary. If necessary, they would use deadly force to prevent the family's escape. Mercy provided detailed information about the underground layout. There were only 2 entrances, one through the enlarged root cellar beneath the main house and another concealed exit nearly a quarter-mile away in the woods. Both were fortified and stocked with weapons, and Ezekiel had trained his sons to defend them with military precision. The rescuers would have to cross nearly a mile of open ground to reach the property, terrain that offered little cover. Using Johansson's tracking expertise, they identified a route along creek beds and tree lines to remain unseen. Moving with the silence of hunters, they advanced toward the farm under the cover of darkness, fully aware that discovery would mean death for themselves and the captives. What awaited them at the Harden property was worse than anything they had imagined. The land was scarred with fresh excavations far beyond any agricultural purpose. Piles of earth and stone littered the fields, and the heavy stench of lime and decay hung in the air. From a distance, the farmhouse appeared peaceful, lamplight glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the chimneys. But as the men drew closer, faint sounds drifted through the night. Muffled voices from beneath the ground, choked screams quickly silenced in the steady, metallic rhythm of tools striking stone. The assault began precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning, the hour when the family was least likely to be alert. Winters and Johansson advanced toward the main cellar entrance while Stokes and Crawford moved to intercept anyone escaping through the hidden exit. Brewster remained with the horses, ready to provide covering fire if the plan failed. What they found at the entrance shocked them. It was no simple cellar, but a defensive stronghold engineered with precision. The Hardens had spent years fortifying it, creating interlocking fields of fire and hidden vantage points designed to repel intruders. But on that night, their arrogance proved fatal. After years of believing themselves untouchable, they never imagined that justice would come creeping through the dark. When Winters and Johansson descended into the depths of the underground labyrinth, they found Ezekiel Harden and his sons entirely unprepared for confrontation, preoccupied instead with the grim ritual of preparing their captives for execution. The rescue itself was both simpler and far more horrifying than the raiders had imagined. William Patterson was discovered chained inside a narrow stone cell barely large enough for a man to stand, weak from starvation, but still coherent and alive. Rebecca Foster was in far worse condition, showing unmistakable signs of the cruel treatments Temperance had administered to break her will. Luther Grimby was found barely conscious, his body and mind shattered after weeks of captivity and psychological torment. As the rescuers pushed deeper into the cave system, they uncovered horrors that defied human comprehension. The limestone chambers had become a charnel house of bones, scraps of clothing, and personal effects, an archaeological archive of slaughter spanning nearly a decade. The sheer scale of death was overwhelming. Among the evidence were Mercy's meticulous records, written in a steady, deliberate hand and organized with the precision of a merchant's ledger. These notebooks listed the names, descriptions, and possessions of 67 victims over 8 years, far exceeding what authorities had previously known. It was among the most extensive catalogs of murder in the history of the young nation. Perhaps the most chilling discovery was Ezekiel's so-called courtroom. The chamber contained a makeshift judge's bench adorned with crude religious symbols, and along the walls were displayed personal trophies, scalps, jewelry, weapons, and keepsakes, arranged like sacred relics. It was a museum of human cruelty, testifying to the family's perverse pride in their crimes. The capture of the Hardens was swift but ferocious. Ezekiel and his sons, refusing to surrender, fought savagely through the tunnels rather than face the justice they had denied others. The patriarch showed no surprise at being discovered. Instead, he launched into a deranged sermon about divine judgment, proclaiming his crimes as holy acts. Caleb and Josiah fought with desperate fury, using their intimate knowledge of the caves to launch ambushes from hidden alcoves. For nearly an hour, gunfire echoed through the stone corridors as the raiders advanced inch by inch through passages designed to kill intruders. Above ground, Temperance attempted to erase their sins in flame. She set fire to the main house, hoping to destroy the evidence before the rescuers could seize it. The blaze spread rapidly, threatening to collapse the tunnel entrance and bury everyone beneath the burning structure. Faced with the choice of burning alive or surrendering, the surviving Hardens finally laid down their weapons. Only Mercy submitted willingly, already resigned to her family's fate. She was found kneeling in prayer, her confession having sealed the doom of the household. Her cooperation had been born not of repentance but of terror, fear that her father's growing paranoia would soon lead him to turn his judgment upon her. The Harden family's capture sent shockwaves throughout Kentucky and the wider frontier, shattering the illusion that virtue and respectability could not conceal such monstrous evil. The evidence recovered from the subterranean complex was staggering. Investigators soon realized the cave system extended for nearly 2 miles. Its natural chambers expanded and reinforced to hold dozens of prisoners at once. The physical proof painted a picture of systematic killing that stretched beyond the family's 8 years in Kentucky, suggesting decades of similar crimes across other territories. Among the remains were children's toys and clothing, proof that entire families had perished. The Henleys, missing since a winter blizzard, were found to have been held alive for a week before their execution. Their 2 children, ages 6 and 8, had survived for several days after their parents' deaths before meeting the same fate in the deepest reaches of the caverns. The trial began in late June of 1799 and lasted nearly a month, drawing spectators from across the frontier. The courthouse in Lexington overflowed daily with relatives of the slain, legal scholars, and curious citizens who sensed they were witnessing history's darkest chapter unfold. The evidence was so grotesque that the presiding judge, Samuel Whitmore, ordered parts of the testimony sealed from public record. Ezekiel Harden's behavior in court was as unrepentant as it was disturbing. Rather than deny his guilt, he turned the proceedings into a pulpit, delivering rambling sermons on divine justice. He claimed his family had acted as instruments of God, chosen to purge the frontier of the sinful and corrupt. The murders, he insisted, were sacred acts of purification. The underground chambers were not prisons, but sanctified courts of divine law. Temperance and her sons sought to deflect blame, claiming coercion by Ezekiel's religious tyranny. Temperance said her medical skills had been used against her will, while Caleb and Josiah argued they had been deceived into believing they were soldiers in a holy war. But the evidence left no room for doubt. Mercy's ledgers contained entries in multiple handwritings, proving each family member had participated willingly. Personal effects recovered from their private rooms revealed a pattern of ghoulish fascination. Each had kept mementos of their victims as tokens of satisfaction. Only Mercy expressed true remorse, though even that stemmed more from fear than redemption. Her testimony proved vital in identifying victims and reconstructing the family's crimes. For her cooperation in youth, she was spared the gallows and sentenced instead to life imprisonment. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah were condemned to hang on August 15, 1799. Exactly 1 year after the disappearance of Samuel Fletcher had set their downfall in motion. Mercy spent the next 43 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, becoming one of its longest-serving inmates. The execution drew an unprecedented crowd, more than 4,000 spectators from across the region. The event took on the atmosphere of a grim carnival, with vendors selling food and drink as the masses gathered to witness the end of the frontier's most infamous family of murderers. Ezekiel Harden clung to his fanatical beliefs until his final breath. As the noose tightened around his neck, he delivered one last fevered sermon, cursing the community that had rejected his divine vision. He prophesied that God would punish Kentucky for executing his chosen servants, and warned that the frontier would one day be overrun by the very sinners his family had tried to eradicate. His wife and sons met their deaths in grim silence, their executions closing one of the darkest and most haunting chapters in early American criminal history. In the aftermath, the Harden farm was reduced to ashes. Every building was deliberately burned to the ground in what became a symbolic ritual of purification for a community desperate to erase the stain of horror from its soil. The underground chambers where so many lives had been extinguished were sealed forever with explosives and heavy stone, creating a tomb meant to give the victims long-denied peace. Local authorities declared the land cursed and prohibited any future settlement on the site. Yet the legacy of the Harden family's crimes endured. Their case reshaped the very notion of frontier justice, forcing communities to reconsider the delicate balance between hospitality and vigilance. New laws were enacted requiring background checks for land ownership and establishing protocols for missing person investigations, changes that would influence American law enforcement for generations. Beyond the legal impact, the Harden case served as a grim warning about the dangers of blind faith in religious authority and the seductive mask of respectability. People across the frontier began to look upon their neighbors and traveling strangers with new suspicion, realizing how easily evil could hide behind a pious smile. The trial also set precedents in the use of circumstantial evidence in capital cases and in protecting witnesses who cooperated with authorities. Mercy Harden's testimony proved that family loyalty could be overcome when justice provided protection and incentive, paving the way for future prosecutions of complex criminal enterprises. By 1801, all surviving case records were sealed by court order. Officials justified the decision as a means to protect the victims' families and to prevent copycat killers from emulating the Harden's methods. For nearly 2 centuries, the full truth remained buried within those sealed documents, surviving only as fragments in folklore and ghost stories whispered across rural Kentucky. Historians granted access to the files were forced to sign strict confidentiality agreements, ensuring that the most disturbing details would remain hidden from public knowledge. Over time, the memory of the Hardens faded into vague legend, stories of bad folks who once lived near Beaver Creek. As property boundaries shifted and new settlers arrived, even the location of the original farm was forgotten. By the mid-1800s, only a few aging residents could recall exactly where the house had stood. When the long-lost records were rediscovered in 1987, historians were finally able to reconstruct the full story of Kentucky's first family of serial killers. Yet even with modern research, unsettling mysteries remain. The limestone cave system beneath the property has never been fully explored, and investigators believe more victims may still lie hidden in the deepest, most dangerous passages that 18th-century searchers could not reach. Though forensic technology might one day reveal new truths, local authorities have shown little appetite for reopening the past, preferring to let the dead rest rather than risk reawakening old horrors. Perhaps most chilling of all, the Harden case has forced scholars to re-examine other unexplained disappearances across the early American frontier. How many other respectable families might have concealed similar secrets? How many travelers thought lost to wild animals, robbers, or natural misfortune were in fact victims of calculated ritualized murder? Statistical studies of frontier-era disappearances have revealed troubling patterns. Clusters of vanishings near prosperous, devout families in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. While no definitive links have been proven, the similarities are striking enough to invite deeper investigation. The ultimate answers died with Ezekiel Harden on that August morning in 1799. Yet the questions linger, dark reminders that evil often wears an innocent face. The most terrifying acts in human history are rarely committed by monsters in the shadows, but by those who believe they are doing righteous work. The frontier, with its isolation and lack of oversight, offered fertile ground for such twisted conviction. The Harden case exposes the fragile nature of trust in tight-knit communities, where reputation often outweighed evidence and comfort silenced suspicion. The cost of that complacency was measured in human lives. This haunting story reminds us that early American justice was far more complex and more horrifying than history books often admit. The same wilderness that promised freedom and opportunity also harbored predators who knew how to exploit faith, kindness, and desperation. And so the final question remains: was everything about the Harden family truly revealed? Or do darker secrets still lie buried beneath the Kentucky soil, waiting to be unearthed?